The metal locker slammed shut with a hollow clang that echoed through the silent corridor of the Galactic Academy of Combat Arts. Kay adjusted the cloth-wrapped bundle on her shoulder, ignoring the whispers that followed her like shadows. It was her third week at the academy, and the novelty of having a human student hadn't worn off yet. The morning sun streamed through the massive crystal windows, casting rainbow patterns across the polished floor. Kay's boots made soft tapping sounds as she walked toward the training arena. She was early, as usual. Being the only human in the advanced combat class meant she had to work twice as hard to prove herself. The bundle on her shoulder contained her great-grandmother's katana, a blade that had been in her family for 5 generations. While other students carried sleek energy weapons and plasma blades, Kay chose to honor her heritage. The sword wasn't just steel and tradition. It was a reminder of home, of Earth, and of everything she represented here among the stars. As she entered the training arena, she noticed Reed and his group already there. The tall, silver-skinned alien from the Bright Crest system was showing off his latest weapon upgrade. His plasma blade hummed with a distinctive purple glow, drawing admiring looks from his followers. "Well, look who's here," Reed's voice carried across the arena. "Our primitive weapons expert." His silver skin rippled with patterns of amusement, a trait typical of his species, still carrying that metal stick, eh? Kay unwrapped her katana without responding. The steel caught the morning light, its polished surface reflecting the arena's glow. She began her morning routine, moving through forms that had been practiced on Earth for centuries. "You know," Reed continued, clearly annoyed by her lack of response, "my blade can cut through battleship armor. What's yours good for?" "Cutting vegetables." His friends laughed, their various alien features displaying amusement in different ways, some changing colors, others emitting soft sounds or light patterns. Kay continued her practice, her movements fluid and precise. The katana moved like water in her hands, each swing ending exactly where it should. She had learned long ago that responding to mockery only encouraged more of it. The training arena gradually filled with other students. Some carried weapons that looked more like artwork than tools of combat, crystalline structures that floating in air, energy whips that sang as they moved, and neural interfaces that could project force fields at will. Professor Lance, a towering 4-armed instructor from the core worlds, entered the arena. His deep voice cut through the chatter. "Gather round, students. The Academy Board has made an important announcement." The students formed a semicircle around him, Kay standing slightly apart from the others. She noticed Reed positioning himself front and center, his plasma blade still activated despite training protocols. "The annual weapons demonstration tournament will begin next week," Professor Lance announced, his 4 arms moving in complex patterns as he spoke. "This year's format will be different. Instead of separate categories for different weapon types, all participants will compete in a single bracket." A murmur of excitement rippled through the crowd. Kay felt her heart skip a beat. Until now, traditional weapons had their own category. A small group mostly consisting of students from younger spacefaring races. This change meant she would face the advanced weapons directly. "This is to promote understanding of different combat styles," Professor Lance continued. "Safety fields will be active at all times. The tournament will test not just your weapon skills, but your ability to adapt to different combat situations." Reed's voice cut through the murmurs. "Professor, will there be a handicap system for less advanced weapons?" His eyes fixed on Kay's katana, and several students snickered. Professor Lance's expression remained neutral. "All weapons that pass safety inspection will be treated equally. The tournament will test the wielder's skill, not just the weapon's capabilities." Kay felt a small smile form on her lips. Her fingers tightened around the katana's handle, feeling the familiar wrap of the ray skin beneath the silk cord. The sword had been more than just a weapon to her family. It had been a teacher of patience, discipline, and timing. As the professor continued explaining the tournament rules, Kay's mind was already working. She had been studying how different energy weapons interacted with various materials. There were properties of traditionally forged steel that even the Academy's advanced systems hadn't fully explored. Perhaps it was time to show everyone why humans hadn't completely abandoned the old ways, even as they reached for the stars. The training arena buzzed with excitement as students practiced for the upcoming tournament. Kay stood at her usual corner, carefully maintaining her katana. The smell of sword oil filled her small space as she worked, a scent that reminded her of early morning practices back on Earth. Reed's voice cut through her concentration. Time to settle this once and for all. He stood there with his usual group of followers, his plasma blade already activated. Let's have a practice match, Kay. Show everyone what your ancient weapon can do. The other students stopped their practice to watch. Kay looked up from her work, noting how Reed had chosen this moment when she was cleaning her sword. She took her time finishing the maintenance, each movement deliberate and unhurried. Your blade can't even activate, Reed continued, making his plasma weapon dance in complex patterns. Purple light traced beautiful but deadly arcs through the air. How do you expect to compete against modern weapons? Kay finally stood, her katana gleaming under the arena lights. A sword doesn't need to be activated, she said quietly. It's always ready. Reed's silver skin rippled with patterns of what looked like laughter. Ready? Ready for what? Getting melted by my plasma blade. He stepped into the practice circle, his weapon humming with power. Come on, human. Show us what Earth's finest technology can do. Kay stepped into the circle, her movements calm and measured. The other students formed a ring around them, their whispers filling the air. Some had their data tablets out, ready to record what they surely thought would be a humiliating defeat for the human student. This sword, Kay said, holding the katana in a traditional ready stance, was forged by my great-great-grandmother's hands. The steel was folded over 1,000 times, each fold removing impurities and adding strength. It's not just a weapon. It's centuries of knowledge given form. Lovely story, Reed mocked, his plasma blade shifting color slightly as he adjusted its power settings. But knowledge becomes outdated. That's why we evolve, create better tools. Your sword belongs in a museum. Without warning, Reed launched forward, his plasma blade cutting a bright arc through the air. Kay shifted slightly, letting the energy weapon pass by with millimeters to spare. The heat from the blade warmed her face, but she didn't flinch, too scared to block. Reed taunted, launching into a series of quick attacks. His blade hummed and crackled as it cut through the air, leaving trailing afterimages of purple light. Kay moved like water, her footwork precise and economical. She didn't try to block the plasma blade. She didn't need to. Each of Reed's attacks met empty air as she shifted position, letting his own momentum carry him past her again and again. Stand and fight. Reed's pattern showed frustration now, his attacks becoming wider and more aggressive. The watching students murmured as they realized Kay hadn't made a single offensive move yet. Fighting isn't just about attacking, Kay said, continuing to move just out of reach. My great-grandmother used to say that the sword teaches us when not to strike. Reed's next attack was a powerful overhead slash. This time, Kay moved forward instead of away, her katana rising in a subtle arc. There was a sound like ringing crystal, and suddenly Reed's plasma blade flickered. He stared in shock at his weapon, then at the katana that had somehow disrupted its energy field. Impossible, he whispered, his skin patterns showing disbelief. How did you? Kay lowered her sword. The tournament will be interesting, she said simply, then bowed and walked away, leaving Reed staring at his malfunctioning weapon. The watching students burst into excited conversation. Some rushed to help Reed with his blade, while others hurried to their data tablets to research traditional Earth weapons. Professor Lance, who had been watching silently from the arena entrance, made a quick note on his tablet. Later that evening, as Kay practiced alone in the arena, she allowed herself a small smile. She hadn't shown them everything, not even close. The properties of folded steel that could disrupt energy fields were just the beginning. There were reasons why humans still studied the old ways, even as they mastered new ones. The tournament would show everyone that sometimes the oldest weapons held the deepest secrets. Kay ran her hand along the katana's blade, feeling the subtle patterns in the steel that had been hammered in centuries ago. Modern scanning systems might see them as imperfections, but she knew better. Every one of those patterns had a purpose, and soon, everyone else would know it too. The Academy's lab hummed with quiet energy as Kay studied the readings on her tablet. It was well past midnight, but she needed to understand exactly how her katana had disrupted Reed's plasma blade. The lab's soft blue lighting gleamed off the sword laid carefully on the scanning platform. "You're still at it." Tom's voice made her look up. The other human student at the academy specialized in advanced physics, and his help had been invaluable. He walked over, carrying 2 cups of coffee, a rare luxury this far from Earth. Kay accepted 1 cup gratefully. "Look at this," she said, pointing to the scan results. "The folding patterns in the steel aren't random. Each layer creates a unique energy signature." Tom leaned in, his eyes widening as he studied the data. "This is incredible. The traditional folding method accidentally created a kind of energy disruption matrix. Your great-grandmother was building quantum interference patterns without even knowing it." "Not an accident," Kay corrected, taking a sip of coffee. "The old masters knew steel had special properties. They just described them differently." She ran a finger along the blade's surface. "They talked about the sword having a spirit, about metal remembering how it was folded." The lab door slid open, and both humans quickly covered the sword with a cloth. Reed walked in, his silver skin dull in the low light. He carried his plasma blade, now fixed, but clearly modified. Working late, his voice carried its usual mocking tone, but there was something else there now. Uncertainty. "Trying to add some modern technology to your antique." Kay uncovered the sword. "No, just learning from it." She gestured to the scans. "Every fold in this blade tells a story. Each hammer strike added something unique." Reed moved closer, his curiosity apparently stronger than his desire to mock. "Your primitive forging couldn't possibly affect energy weapons. My blade malfunctioned, that's all." Tom spoke up, pointing to the scan results. "Actually, the folding pattern creates quantum-level disruptions in energy fields. It's similar to how some modern shield breakers work, but the effect is completely passive." Reed's skin patterns showed confusion. "That's impossible. You can't get that kind of effect from just folding metal." "The folding isn't just folding," Kay explained, bringing up a detailed scan. "The steel was heated and cooled thousands of times. Different parts of the blade were treated differently. The edge, the core, the back, each has its own structure." She pointed to specific patterns in the metal. "Modern weapons rely on stable energy fields, but this blade's structure naturally creates tiny fluctuations in those fields. Not enough to see, but enough to cause problems for energy-based weapons." "You're saying this was done on purpose?" Reed's tone was skeptical, but his skin patterns showed intense interest. "Not exactly," Tom said. "The ancient sword makers were trying to create the strongest, sharpest blades they could. They developed these techniques through centuries of trial and error. They didn't know they were creating quantum interference patterns." Kay stood up, lifting her katana. "But they knew something was special about these blades. They passed down their techniques exactly, never changing them, because they knew they worked." She smiled slightly. "Sometimes you discover the science behind the magic centuries later." Reed watched as she sheathed the sword. His skin patterns shifted through several colors before settling. "The tournament starts tomorrow," he said finally. "Don't think this changes anything. My blade is ready for your tricks now." After he left, Tom looked at Kay. "He modified his plasma containment field, didn't he?" Kay nodded. "Double-layered, from the sound of it. But he doesn't understand yet." She picked up her tablet, showing a new set of scans. "The disruption effect changes based on the blade's movement. The faster it moves, the stronger the effect becomes. And you've been practicing new moves. Tom grinned. Fast ones. Kay began packing up her equipment. Tomorrow would be a long day. The tournament would start with preliminary rounds, and she needed to be ready. Reed wasn't the only one who would underestimate her sword. As she left the lab, she thought about her great-grandmother, about all the generations of sword makers who had poured their knowledge into steel and fire. They might not have had scanners or quantum field theory, but they had something just as valuable: patience, observation, and the wisdom to know that some knowledge could only be gained through time and tradition. The tournament arena blazed with light as Kay watched her first opponent take position. The alien student carried an energy staff that crackled with green lightning. Around them, the safety fields shimmered like heat waves in summer air. The crowd murmured, most expecting a quick victory for the energy weapon. Kay held her katana in a low stance, remembering her research from the night before. Each type of energy weapon had its own unique field pattern. The trick wasn't to fight against them. It was to work with them, to let the sword's natural properties do what they did best. Begin. The judge's voice boomed through the arena. Her opponent spun the staff dramatically, green energy arcing through the air. Kay simply waited, sword low, watching. The staff wielder charged, bringing their weapon down in a powerful overhead strike. Kay stepped forward instead of back, her blade rising in a precise arc. The katana passed through the energy field like it wasn't there. The staff's green glow flickered and died where the blade touched it. The crowd gasped. 3 moves later, the match was over. Kay's opponent stood disarmed, their energy staff dark and silent on the ground. The judges stared at their instruments, trying to understand what had happened. In the waiting area, Reed watched with narrowed eyes. His skin patterns shifted rapidly, showing deep thought and concern. His first match wasn't until later, but he couldn't take his eyes off Kay's fights. The day continued, and Kay faced different weapons in each round. A sonic blade that should have shattered steel, but instead found its waves scattered by the katana's fold patterns. A quantum phaser that tried to bypass physical matter entirely, only to find its fields disrupted by the sword's structure. Between matches, Tom brought her data from the arena sensors. "You're causing quite a stir," he said, showing her the readings. "The science department is going crazy trying to figure out how a primitive weapon is doing this." Kay studied the data while maintaining her blade. Each match taught her something new about how the sword interacted with different energy types. "The old masters were right," she said quietly. "The sword learns with each battle. Or maybe it's teaching me." Her fourth match of the day proved the most challenging. Her opponent wielded dual plasma whips, weapons that could attack from multiple angles at once. The alien fighter moved with incredible speed, their whips creating a cage of deadly energy around them. Kay felt the heat of the plasma whips as they danced around her. But she had learned from her earlier matches. The faster her blade moved, the stronger its disruption effect became. She began a series of traditional kata, movements practiced for centuries on Earth. The sword blurred through the air, creating paths of disrupted energy through the plasma whip's pattern. The crowd fell silent as they watched. Kay's movements didn't look like fighting. They looked like a dance, each step precise, each cut flowing into the next. The plasma whips tried to find gaps in her defense, but the katana was always there, its ancient steel singing through the air. When the match ended, even the judges stood to applaud. Kay's opponent bowed deeply to her, their own weapons deactivated but undamaged. "Your sword," they said with genuine respect. "It moves like it's alive." From his position in the waiting area, Reed touched the controls of his modified plasma blade. His next match would begin soon, but his skin patterns showed worry. He had thought the sword's effect on his blade had been a malfunction, something he could counter with better technology. Now he wasn't so sure. Kay returned to the preparation area, carefully wiping down her blade. She had qualified for the semifinals, but tomorrow would bring even greater challenges. The remaining competitors would have watched her matches, studied her techniques. They would come prepared. She smiled slightly as she worked. Let them prepare. They were still thinking about the sword as a weapon, trying to counter its effects. But it was more than that. It was centuries of knowledge given form, the weight of tradition and innovation combined. Tomorrow would show them that sometimes the oldest secrets were the deepest ones. The morning of the semifinals brought a larger crowd than the Academy had seen in years. Students, teachers, and even visitors from nearby systems packed the stands. Kay sat in the preparation area, watching the massive screens showing replays of yesterday's matches. Her katana lay across her lap as she applied a fresh coat of oil to the blade. "Your first opponent changed their weapon," Tom said, hurrying over with his tablet. "They switched to a multi-phase energy sword. It can shift frequencies to bypass disruption effects." Kay nodded, not looking up from her work. "They think the sword's effect is fixed, that it only works on specific energy frequencies." She tested the blade's edge with a single strand of hair. It split cleanly. "They still don't understand." The announcement system crackled to life, calling the first semifinal match. Kay walked onto the arena floor, the crowd's murmur growing louder. Her opponent, a tall fighter from the gas giants of the Outer Rim, activated their new weapon. The blade shifted colors like an oil slick, each hue representing a different energy frequency. "Scared," her opponent called out, the translation system carrying their voice clearly. "This blade can adapt to any defense. Your tricks won't work today." Kay settled into her stance, saying nothing. The judge gave the signal to begin, and her opponent charged, their multi-phase blade creating a rainbow of deadly light. The first clash sent sparks of energy across the arena. The alien fighter grinned as their blade made contact with the katana, but the grin faded as they realized what was happening. The sword wasn't just disrupting one frequency. It was responding to each phase shift, the ancient folded steel adapting just as it had adapted to countless challenges over the centuries. "Impossible," they gasped, backing away. "How are you matching every frequency?" Kay moved forward, her blade flowing through traditional forms that had been practiced for generations. "The sword doesn't match frequencies," she explained calmly. "It disrupts the very concept of stable energy fields. The more complex your weapon, the more vulnerabilities it has." The match ended with her opponent's weapon shorting out completely, its complex systems overwhelmed by the simple elegance of folded steel. The crowd erupted in cheers, and Kay could hear students in the stands already debating the physics behind what they'd just seen. Reed watched from the competitor's area, his skin patterns shifting rapidly. He had won his own quarter-final match yesterday, but now he would face his teammate in the other semifinal. His modified plasma blade hummed at his side, its containment field reinforced after studying Kay's previous matches. Kay's second semifinal match proved even more spectacular. Her opponent wielded a legendary quantum blade, a weapon said to exist in multiple dimensions at once. The alien fighter moved with incredible skill, their blades seemingly attacking from several angles simultaneously. But Kay had spent years learning from her sword. The katana moved like water, its aged steel finding the perfect path through the quantum blade's attacks. Where science said there should be multiple strikes, the sword found the single true cut. Reality itself seemed to bend around the blade, traditional techniques working in harmony with physics that modern science was only beginning to understand. The old masters, Kay explained to the judges after her victory. They didn't have quantum scanners or energy field monitors, but they knew steel had properties beyond the obvious. They spent lifetimes learning to work with the metal, not against it. As she walked off the arena floor, she passed Reed heading to his own semifinal match. His skin patterns showed a mix of emotions, respect, worry, and determination. "Tomorrow then," he said quietly, "in the finals." Kay nodded. They both knew he would win his match. He was too skilled, too well-trained to lose to anyone else in the tournament. Their final clash was inevitable. Later, in the quiet of the Academy's garden, Kay sat beneath the artificial stars, her sword across her knees. Tomorrow would bring the ultimate test, not just of her weapon against his, but of two completely different approaches to combat. Modern innovation against ancient wisdom, power against technique. She smiled slightly, feeling the weight of centuries in the blade before her. Tomorrow would show everyone that the future belonged not to those who abandoned the past, but to those who learned from it. The arena fell silent as Kay and Reed took their positions for the final match. The usual safety field sparkled with extra strength. The Academy had doubled them after yesterday's semifinals. Above them, floating cameras captured every angle for the thousands watching across different worlds. Reed's plasma blade ignited with a deep purple glow, but something was different about it today. The blade's energy field had a complex, layered look that Kay hadn't seen before. His silver skin rippled with determination as he settled into his fighting stance. "I spent all night modifying it," Reed said, his voice carrying in the quiet arena. "Multiple containment fields, rotating frequencies, adaptive power settings. It's ready for anything your sword can do." Kay drew her katana slowly, the steel catching the arena lights. The blade looked plain next to Reed's glowing weapon, but those who watched closely could see patterns in the metal, countless folds created by careful hands centuries ago. "Begin." The judge's command echoed through the arena. Reed moved first, his blade tracing purple arcs through the air as he launched a series of quick attacks. Kay met each one with precise movements, her sword flowing from position to position like water. Sparks flew where the weapons met, but this time Reed's blade didn't flicker or fail. "See." Reed's skin patterns showed triumph. "Your disruption trick won't work anymore. Technology adapts, evolves. Tradition just stays the same." Kay didn't respond, focusing instead on the way their weapons interacted. She could feel something different in how her sword met his blade, not resistance exactly, but a kind of recognition. The steel was teaching her something new. Their fight intensified. Reed's plasma blade hummed and crackled as he pressed his attack, using every advanced technique in his arsenal. His weapon shifted frequencies rapidly, trying to find a way past the katana's disruptive effect. The arena's sensors struggled to keep up with the energy readings, but Kay had spent countless hours learning from her sword. Each movement flowed into the next, traditional forms adapting to meet modern attacks. Where Reed sought to overwhelm with power and technology, she found efficiency and balance. "Why won't you fall?" Reed's frustration showed in his attacks as they grew stronger but less controlled. His blade's energy field fluctuated wildly as he poured more power into it. "The sword isn't trying to beat your weapon," Kay explained, moving through another perfect form. "It's harmonizing with it. Every time you change frequencies, you create new patterns. The blade reads those patterns through centuries of folded steel." Their weapons clashed again, but this time something different happened. Instead of trying to disrupt Reed's blade, Kay's sword seemed to catch the plasma energy, redirect it. The purple glow swirled around the steel like water around a stone in a stream. The crowd gasped. Even Reed paused for a moment, his skin patterns showing disbelief. Kay hadn't just learned to defend against energy weapons. She had learned to work with them, using her sword's properties in ways the old masters could never have imagined, but somehow had prepared for. "Impossible," Reed whispered, but there was wonder in his voice now, not mockery. The final exchange happened so fast that many in the audience missed it. Reed committed to one last attack, his blade charged to maximum power. Kay moved as if she had anticipated it hours ago, her sword describing a perfect arc through the air. There was a sound like crystal chimes, a flash of purple light, and then silence. Reed stood frozen, staring at his deactivated weapon. Kay's blade rested gently against his shoulder, not even leaving a mark through the safety field. The arena erupted in cheers. "How?" Reed asked as Kay lowered her sword. "I had every advantage. Power, technology, everything." Kay sheathed her katana carefully. "Not everything. You forgot that technology doesn't replace wisdom. It adds to it. This sword isn't powerful because it's old. It's powerful because it represents centuries of learning, passed down and preserved for the right moment. As the judges approached to declare her victory, Kay saw understanding finally spread across Reed's skin patterns. He had sought to prove the superiority of modern weapons, but had instead discovered something far more valuable: the knowledge that true progress didn't mean abandoning the past, but learning from it. A week after the tournament, the Academy's main lecture hall was packed beyond capacity. Students sat in the aisles, stood along the walls, and some even watched through floating screens in the overflow rooms. Kay stood at the front, her katana laid carefully on a display stand beside her. Professor Lance stepped forward, his forearms moving in excited gestures as he addressed the crowd. What we witnessed in the tournament wasn't just a victory of one weapon over others. It was a reminder that knowledge takes many forms, and wisdom can be passed down in ways we don't always recognize. Kay watched as Tom projected the analysis data they'd gathered. The scans showed the sword's complex structure, the patterns created by centuries of careful folding. But now there were new readings, data showing how the blade interacted with different energy types, how it could redirect and harmonize with them. The old masters, Kay explained to the attentive audience, didn't have our technology or our understanding of physics. But they knew there was something special about how the steel behaved. They created techniques to work with these properties, preserve them through generations. In the front row, Reed sat with his skin showing patterns of deep interest. His plasma blade lay deactivated on his desk, partially disassembled. He had spent the past week studying how Kay's sword had affected its containment fields. But this isn't about proving old ways are better than new ones, Kay continued. It's about understanding that progress doesn't mean abandoning what we've learned before. My sword worked because it combined centuries of knowledge with modern understanding. She picked up the katana, demonstrating a simple kata. The blade caught the light, and sensors around the room recorded how it created subtle disturbances in the ambient energy fields. The steel remembers how it was folded, how it was hammered and shaped. Each layer creates patterns we're only now beginning to understand. The Academy's board members watched with great interest as Kay and Tom explained their findings. The properties they had discovered in traditionally folded steel were already leading to new research in energy field manipulation and shield design. After the lecture, Reed approached Kay as she carefully wrapped her sword. His skin patterns showed a mix of respect and curiosity. "I've been thinking," he said, holding out his modified plasma blade. "Would you be interested in helping me understand how your sword's properties could improve modern weapons?" Kay smiled. "Only if you help me understand how plasma containment fields could be used to enhance traditional blade